So, yeah, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Sarah Jones. So I'm the founder and now the caretaker of Full Circle Funerals, and I also funeral direct. So I am not an expert in sustainability or in green funerals, but we do have a really strong sense that to more and more people, care and concern for the environment is increasingly important. And we believe really strongly that knowledge is power. So the more that people know about different choices and the impact that those choices might have on the environment, then for those people for whom that's important, that they can include that knowledge in the choices that they make. So I'm going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through quite a lot of things relatively briefly, and then there'll be some references and things at the end, so you can pick and choose the bits that you're most interested in finding out a little bit more about. So I'm going to start a little bit just sharing some principles about sustainability and funeral care, then just quickly reviewing our current options for committal. Then I'm going to share a little bit about some research that Planet Mark did. And at that point, we're going to flip to slides that look a little bit different because they're their slides. And then I'm just going to break it down a little bit and think through actually what are the choices before, during and after the funeral that may be relevant when we're thinking about sustainability. Then a very brief look at carbon mitigation. And then some brief consideration to what our next steps might be as individuals, but also in the spaces and industries in which we work. So, I mean, the main principle, I guess, to share is that it's quite hard. You know, when people, as I think everyone on the call will appreciate because of what you do, when people find themselves needing to make funeral arrangements, they often have quite a lot of different objectives in mind. There might be maybe care for the environment, but there may also be many other things and people and factors that are all important to them, and they're trying to navigate how to put all of those objectives, some of which sometimes feel competing, together into an event that is going to reflect the person and their wishes and views in the right way. So the way that I like to think about it is that you don't just have a green funeral or a not green funeral. Actually, it can be a continuum. So on one end of the continuum, you have choices and funerals, which maybe none of the choices really have factored in the environment. On the other end of the continuum, you have a funeral where the people who've arranged it and the person who's died, that's really been the primary objective. It was about making choices which were right for the planet. And then you have everything in between. And I think it's important to also honour the in-between bit. So for people who want to consider the environment, but not exclusively, there are also other things they need to think and worry about. I think we need to enable that as much as we can. As in any space and industry, there are some quite significant structural challenges to making funerals sustainable. 77-ish% of people in the UK choose cremation, flame cremation. Most of those cremators are currently still run by fossil fuels. And my understanding is that only less than half of them have fully functioning abatement systems in them. We also, as an industry, run traditionally on very large diesel-fueled cars. And again, it takes time and structural change to address some of these issues to make the industry more sustainable. So I see our role individually and collectively about trying to enable people to consider the environment in a way that works for them and then facilitate that process. And I think it's really my personal view. I know not everybody agrees, but I think we need to be careful that we don't create another moral pressure, that people need to, you know, that they get the sense, certainly from us at Full Circle, that they have to make choices which fit with the environment. I think we would want that to be a much more collaborative conversation with people. Okay, so again, for many of you in the room, you know this, but for me, I always find it quite helpful to break it down a little bit, because if we think about a funeral, we've got the bits before the funeral, which relate to the physical care of the person who's died and also the arrangement process. During the funeral, there are an awful lot of bits that come together to create the event. So we have the choice of the committal. So by that, I find that a gentler word than body disposal, but it's ultimately what that's referring to. So what is the final place that that person is going to? And then there are all the bits, the accessories, so the coffin, the flowers, the service sheets, you've got the travel, you've got the vehicles. And then after the funeral, in that post-funeral period, which can be incredibly long, there are also lots of choices, each of which have an impact on the environment. And that includes things like urns, headstones, travel, memorialization, all sorts of different things. And if we think about the impact of a funeral, it is the aggregate of the impact of all of these individual choices. And I think when we're supporting people or thinking about our own choices, that breaks it down into something which feels a little bit more manageable. You've got lots of individual choices added up together, which make a funeral and collectively have an impact. So the committal options that we have available to us at the moment in the UK. So natural burial is the principle of natural burial is that people are buried at single depth, so one person per grave. And it is generally accepted that when somebody is buried more shallowly, then the decomposition happens aerobically, whereas in a double depth grave, the lower buried person, the decomposition would be anaerobic, and that process is worse in terms of its impact on the environment. So natural burial grounds, it's about having a single depth burial. Everything that goes into the grave needs to be biodegradable. There's no grave litter, and in the true principle of natural burial, anything planted in or around the grave needs to be native to the place that the burial's happening. So woodland burial, now a woodland burial ground refers to a burial and a tree being linked. Not all woodland burial grounds are natural burial grounds. You can have a woodland burial ground which doesn't adhere to the principles of natural burial. So woodland burial doesn't necessarily mean that it's a more sustainable or greener choice. It depends on the practice of that woodland burial ground. And then there are alternatives, of course, to burial. So we have, the local authority burial grounds, other private burial grounds. And actually, when you're trying to understand the relative impacts of those, you really need to kind of look under the hood and find out what the practice is by those burial authorities. What is it that they are doing? What coffins do they allow? Which materials are allowed to be in the grave? How do they manage the grave afterwards? With natural burial, in terms of the amount of fuel or energy used, if they are dug by hand, then that uses less fuel than if they were being dug by a digger, purely because the digger runs on fuel. Flame cremation, as I mentioned, Jade, there's a lady or gentleman called Sandy who's popping up many times trying to get in. I don't know if you can help them. So flame cremation, as I mentioned, at the moment is chosen by 77-ish% of people. It's quite a challenging choice from an environmental perspective. The majority of flame cremators in this country are run by fossil fuels. So there is the use of fossil fuels. There are abatement schemes, but they are, so my understanding is about 40% of cremators currently have these abatement provisions within them. And there is legislation which is just in a consultation period, but is due to come out, which will then, I guess, put greater demands on the amount of abatement and what is being abated in flame cremators. There's an increase now, or the introduction of electric cremators. So they are about replacing the fossil fuels to run the flame cremator, but then it is still a flame cremation. So some people feel really positive about that as an alternative. There are still a few questions. So in particular, some people have raised that it takes longer for the cremator to reach temperature. So more time energy-wise is required to get the cremator up to temperature, and also that the cremations may take longer because of the way that the heat is distributed within the cremator. So there are some challenges to it, specifically about whether it's actually more efficient if you're doing it for a small amount, like heating the machine for a small amount of cremations, than to switch it off again. And then there is also there are increasing conversations about whether biofuel would be a good alternative to power the flame cremators. There are some people, hopefully you can see the little image, there's also been some places where they've tried to be creative in terms of thinking about how they can use the energy. So Redditch crematorium, the energy and the heat, the excess heat produced was used, and I believe still is used, to heat the local town's swimming pool. So that's sort of trying to be creative with some circular economy principles. So thinking about, well, actually that heat is waste for the crematorium, and how can that waste be used somewhere else in the ecosystem, so that it's no longer waste, it's actually contributing to something else functioning well. Then water cremation. So this may be something that some of you are familiar with. So water cremation is a process, it's an alternative to flame cremation. It uses alkaline hydrolysis, so an alkali fluid under very high pressure, which is placed inside a water chamber. You can see the chamber in the image. And then under high pressure, it takes 3 or 4 hours for the cremation to take place. After the cremation, the output, as it were, is ash. The ash is white, as opposed to the grayer ash that we are more familiar with after a flame cremation. This has been around, this technology has been used in the US and Europe for many years, and it should be available in the UK very, very soon. Just where and to whom, I think, is not 100% clear at the moment. So the supporters of water cremation have some certainty about the fact that this is a better option, because we're not creating any air pollution. There's nothing that needs to be abated. There are a few questions raised by some about the fact that a lot of water will be used in the process, and therefore we also need to consider water scarcity when we're thinking about our choices. Then human composting. So human composting is currently licensed in Washington State. The person who has died is placed inside a vessel, and you can see on this image the little circles are the individual vessels that people would be placed into, and a combination of wood chip, alfalfa and straw is placed into the vessel with the person who's died. Oxygen is added, and then after 30 days the result is compost. Now I've put on this slide that I think we have to wait for this one. There are some groups and people who believe that they are going to be making this available in the UK sooner maybe than I thought when I wrote this slide. But as far as I'm aware, it's not available at the moment. I think that what I've heard anecdotally is that one of the challenges is that it produces quite a lot of compost. So there needs to be some consideration given about where that compost would go, because not everybody has the sort of transport or garden or place that they could meaningfully use that amount of compost. Okay, so coffins. Now, when considering the sustainability of a coffin or the impact, again, in my very simple way of structuring this in my mind, the key consideration really is the material. So almost forget what the object is. The object is made by a material, and the production and transport of that material will have an environmental impact. Then the second is the process of embalming. So what happens to the person who goes into the coffin? And then a key question is what you're going to do with the coffin. And this is where it gets a little bit grey. We certainly, within funeral care, do not yet know enough factually about the impact of different choices. Because, for example, what we'll see a little bit later on is that cardboard coffins would generally be regarded as a good choice in terms of their environmental impact for the material of the coffin. But then anecdotally, some crematoria have shared that when a cardboard coffin is cremated by flame cremation, they have to use more fuel, because if there's no wood inside the cremator, they lose the fuel source, and cardboard isn't the same sort of fuel source. So they end up using more fossil fuels to be able to complete a cremation with a cardboard coffin than they would with a wood coffin. Now, again, there's no data, publicly available data, to support that, but it sort of does feel like that could make sense. So, going to just go on to tell you a little bit about the Planet Mark research. So, the question posed to Planet Mark are they are an independent sustainability consultancy, and they do a lot of certification work. So they go into businesses and they help them to think about what their impact is, and then they support businesses to work towards, well, carbon net zero is sort of their remit. But the question that was asked of them is, what do we know? What are the greenest funeral choices based on what we currently know and based on the information that is available? The idea was that we would ask this question, that all of the results would be made publicly available, all of it. There are organisations within the funeral industry who have done work to understand the impact of various things within funeral care. So, for example, different coffins. But for commercial reasons, they have decided to keep that data embargoed. So that's things they've paid for, and that data belongs to them. So they haven't made that publicly available, which is not unusual. That would be fairly common practice in most industries if somebody has spent a lot of money to make, to get some commercial data for themselves. The idea with this was, though, that actually it's publicly available. So all of the raw data and all of the information is publicly available. It felt important that it was independently funded, because as soon as something is funded by a particular person, that person kind of ends up with a little bit more control and say, and they become a customer to it. And the idea with this was that actually, if it was funded independently by the community, then there were two bits to that, really. One was it shows that the community want the question answered. If you can't raise the funds, then maybe this isn't something that people want to know. And the second bit is that then there isn't really a paying stakeholder who has a significant influence over the report and the data. So it was £20,000 were crowdfunded by the community, and that went to pay Planet Mark to do this work. There was a peer review process, so quite a few individuals were involved in the peer review, and you can see all of those names on the final report. And then a really important thing to say is that £20,000 doesn't buy you very much in this space. So it was a very narrow scope, and it had lots and lots of limitations. This is very, very far from perfect. But what it looked to do is at least bring together what we currently know, or what is available. And the other important thing is it shows that this can be done. I think when there can be a little bit of a tendency to think it's a bit too hard. We can't get the data. We can't produce this information. We can. It is hard, but hard is okay. So this was the idea with this show. Actually, it is doable. You might need to do it in small steps, but it is doable. So the narrow scope and objectives within the Planet Mark research were to understand the carbon emissions associated with different body disposal choices. So you'll see here we've now moved to a different type of slide. So these are Planet Mark slides, and I thought I should honour their slides by keeping their slides as they are. So these are their output slides from the work. Body disposal isn't necessarily words that I would use either, but it's, it is the accepted words for what we're talking about. They also looked at the carbon emissions associated with frequently used coffins and the bits in and around those coffins. And the idea was to be able to improve public knowledge and awareness so that people could make more evidence-based environmental choices. And the second bit, as I mentioned previously, is about trying to encourage some industry change. So think actually we can do this, and collectively we can create a vision for what a sustainable funeral care system would look like in 2030 or 2040, and we could work towards that. So yeah, the brief was very specific scope, as I've mentioned, just 2 specific areas that they looked at. The data had to be made publicly available. There was peer review, and it's really important, if you remember back to the start, the funeral is made up of lots of different bits. So this is just looking at 2 of those bits. There are still lots of other bits within the funeral that are really important. And it has some really significant limitations. So it doesn't cover the whole funeral. And the other important thing is, so burn data is the glamorous term for the bit I talked about when I mentioned that actually what happens to a cardboard coffin when you put it into a cremator compared to what happens to a wooden coffin when you put it into the cremator. That is not within this report, because that's just not available for them to use. And the other thing is, it's very much about carbon. It hasn't considered the land, air, water, biodiversity impact of the different committal options. But hopefully it's enough that others may pick up the baton and look to do some of that more detailed work. So 2 graphs to have a little look at. So this one relates to the different committal choices. And again, this graph shows you the carbon emissions in kilograms of CO2 emissions related to the different methods. This is basically about the fuel required to fuel this process. So as you can see, not unexpectedly at all, natural gas cremation has the most significant carbon footprint. Then electric cremation, in as much as they were able to get the data, is better because it's using electricity rather than gas. Then resumation, and then traditional burial. They've worked on the assumption in this that it's traditional burial dug by hand rather than by a machine. Every natural burial ground will have a slightly different practice, but certainly where we are, natural burial graves are generally dug by machine. Then the next one to have a little look at is the coffins. So you can see the different coffin types by material on the y-axis, if my maths serves me right after all these years. And then again, same units on the x-axis, so that's carbon emissions in kilograms of CO2 equivalents. And I suppose very briefly, what we can see here is that veneers have a bigger impact, are more carbon intensive. And then we move up towards English willow, then wool, cardboard, solid wood, and then into shrouds, so cotton shrouds. And a biodegradable bag, that is what somebody would be placed in for a water cremation. So something I should have mentioned and didn't is that a coffin is not placed inside a resumator. So water cremation, the process itself, does not involve a coffin. So I appreciate this is a quick flick through. Like I say, there are links at the end of the webinar that you can have a more detailed look at this if you're interested in this specific graph. So the other thing that was I guess beyond scope, but that Planet Marker really felt that they needed to make clear in the report, is that bit I mentioned about the funeral being the accumulation of lots of different choices. And we've seen the numbers there associated with the committal and then the coffin, but they felt it was also really important to recognise that there are lots of other bits of the funeral that can have quite a significant impact. So they specifically mentioned the importance of a headstone. So it is generally accepted or increasingly accepted that, you know, headstones have a significant or can have a significant impact and can be a place to think quite carefully if you want to create a greener funeral. Flowers, although small, can be frequent and again have an impact. And then the big thing that Planet Mark really considered as their work continued is that actually from a post-funeral perspective, if transport is very significant in terms of its environmental impact. That's in everything that we do, in the world in general, not just in funeral care. But if you, as part of your post-funeral ritual, identify a location that you would like to visit regularly and for many years, actually the impact of that over the years will be really significant, and much more significant than anything that you're choosing to do on the day of a funeral. So it doesn't need to be a grave, but for example, if somebody chooses a grave at a distance from where they live, and then part of their post-funeral ritual and meaning making is to regularly visit that grave, maybe with a small bouquet of flowers, actually the impact of that over 20 years or so could be really very significant. It doesn't need to be a grave. It's not about demonizing burial grounds. It may be that there's ashes have been scattered somewhere. It may be that there's just a special place, that a bench, or it could be anything, that there's the creation of an ongoing ritual to go back to that place repeatedly, and the travel associated with that can be quite significant. Okay, so that Planet Mark work, there is a long report with everything in it. There are also 3 shorter reports that they have produced. So one is for the general public. The idea is to have an accessible version for people who want to consider their choices and the impact of those. One is for the industry, so how celebrants listening, how funeral directors, how people who are supporting people with funeral arrangements might consider what the information they need and what they might do. And there's also a document there for policymakers and regulators if they're considering what their impact might be in terms of sustainability with funeral care. There's a short report there as well, so they're all available for you to have a look at if you want to. Okay, so whistle stop tour through, I guess, the choices in the broader sense. The first is before the funeral. So before the funeral, someone will be the person who's died will be physically cared for, and products will be used in that care. So again, the choice of products, it may be that is small for the individual, but then if we think about the amount of people who die in the UK in a year, actually cumulatively, the products that you choose to use in those circumstances are, that could all start to add up to be something quite significant. So for example, using plant-based products to physically care for people would be more sustainable, thinking about the packaging that those products are coming in. Majority of people who are looked after in temperature controlled spaces, and there is fuel and energy required to create those spaces. So it is, again, there's an interesting opportunity to think about how we can look after people well in temperature controlled spaces in a way which is less energy intensive. PPE, so, we use in funeral care lots of PPE, and I am yet to find PPE which is more environmentally kind than single-use disposable items. And the other thing which is not always used, but in fairly common use within funeral care, is that people are placed into body bags. And again, it is challenging to consider how that can be done and how a body bag can serve its purpose well and still be made of a material which is kind to the planet and potentially becomes part of a more sustainable cycle. The funeral itself, so we've talked about the different committal choices, and you've seen the graph there about the relative impact of those choices. Talked a little bit about coffins, so you've probably got a little bit of a sense of what that looks like. But then there's lots of other bits too. So venues. Choosing a venue where lots of people have to travel to at great distance means that you have lots of people travelling and the impact associated with that. And different venues are structured in different ways. So there are more and more venues now which have been built, or at least are, considering retrofitting or managing their venue in a way which is better for the environment. Cars and travel are really significant. So distance is important. Encouraging people to car share again, just reduces the impact of a funeral. These are all sort of simple things that we're more and more people are thinking about day to day within their lives, and it's about just making the link that might also apply to the creation of the funeral event. And then the fuel type of those cars. So as I mentioned, traditionally funeral care runs on diesel. More and more, there's lots of hybrid options now. We have an eco hearse, but there are more and more carriage masters who are who've absolutely seen that people want, and there is a move towards vehicles which are more sustainable. Flowers. So flowers being sourced locally, things that are in season, or there's a wonderful organisation called Flowers from the Farm, which has farms across the UK where you can source local seasonal flowers from, and also some consideration about the packaging that you're using. So, you know, without being too absolute, Oasis generally bad, and cellophane generally bad or avoidable if possible. So if there are other ways to think about how those flowers are cared for, packaged, and then arranged, then these things again can all cumulatively have an impact. So after the funeral, I feel like I've possibly laboured this already, but headstones, if they are being placed, again, there are lots of different choices, and the impact of those different choices is different, and that can be quite an important consideration for people who want to think about the impact of what they are doing. There is a school of thought where actually removing flower holders from headstones would be quite a powerful move, because if you put a flower holder in a headstone, it's kind of giving a pretty clear steer that that flower holder should be regularly refreshed with flowers. So then if people are coming, or they may even be coming just because they want to make sure that that flower holder has fresh flowers in it. And then the process, people might be coming specifically for that, and then they are also bringing flowers where that might not be that that's meaningful for them, but it's about maintaining the grave and the really kind of strong implication, or like there should be fresh flowers there. Ashes, there are lots and lots of choices about what people can do with ashes. Now, I've just mentioned the interspace because, you know, I don't know the detail of it, and I'm very happy to be challenged, but I'm working on the assumption that sending ashes into space is probably quite energy intensive. I don't know that for a fact, but if I had to do a multiple choice, I would guess that that's not a particularly energy efficient way to choose something meaningful for your ashes. That's not to say it shouldn't be available to people. It's just that if people want to consider greener choices, then that's what you do with ashes can certainly be important. And then I've mentioned the regular memorial visits. That might be to a headstone, it might be somewhere else. But one thing that Planet Mark felt quite strongly about, even though it was out of scope of their work, is that actually that was a really important consideration. When people are expressing their wishes or arranging a funeral, careful thought about what you are creating as an ongoing way to remember that person over time can have a really significant impact. Okay, so very briefly, carbon mitigation, because yes, a number of years ago, this was sort of seen as the answer, and I think everybody now accepts it's not the answer, and we should not distract ourselves by thinking it is the answer. But we did ask, there's a local organisation to us called Make It Wild, who are about preserving and maintaining ancient woodlands, and they helped us to understand how many trees you would need to plant if you wanted to mitigate the carbon associated with any individual funeral. And actually, fortunately, the maths was quite easy. So as a very broad brush, if a burial uses creates approximately 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalents and cremation 200, then Make It Wild shared with us that over the lifetime of a tree, it would sequester 3,500 kilograms of CO2. So planting one tree to mitigate the carbon associated with the funeral may be something that some people want to consider. The advantage of a tree, of course, as well, as it supports nature, it supports biodiversity, it creates habitat for animals. There's lots of other advantages to us getting behind tree planting in general. So I'm not suggesting this is the solution, but this may be something that is meaningful for people that we're supporting, and it may be something that people would like to include in their wishes, because it still indicates that they have concern for the environment, and it fits with their beliefs and principles. Okay, so what do we do with all this? So funeral wishes. I'm guessing all of you will be familiar with this from the people who introduce themselves, in the sense of what you will do day to day. So funeral wishes are about documenting your wishes or supporting somebody to document theirs. I think the important thing, if you want to express your wishes, or you want to help somebody who wants to express their wishes and who wants to give concern to the environment, then it's helpful to reflect on the fact that each choice has an impact, rather than just focusing on one or two areas. As I've mentioned, Planet Mark felt quite strongly that actually those post-funeral activities, worth giving that a little bit of more consideration to than we may do otherwise. So if somebody really is concerned about the environment, then talking them through some considerations about what their wishes might be about how people choose to engage afterwards can be helpful. And then this information can be given to the solicitor or the family most likely to make arrangements. Now, as it stands, funeral wishes are not legally enforceable, even if they're in a will. It's just an expression of wishes. There is no obligation on behalf of the executors to fulfil those wishes. I know the Law Commission are currently reviewing some of the law around burial and cremation, and one of the things that they are looking at is the legal status of funeral wishes. But as it stands, they have no legal standing. And the beauty of wishes is that the level of detail is personal choice. In some research that we did with the University of York a number of years ago, actually one of the things that that people shared with us was that actually the level of detail wasn't the important thing. People felt it was just as valuable when arranging a funeral if you knew one or two wishes, compared to having a document with everything expressed really clearly. The act of gifting and fulfilling those wishes was the same. So leaving some funeral wishes is just as powerful if it's one or two wishes, compared to a really detailed sense of everything that is going to happen. So back to some Planet Mark slides. I'm going to share their recommendations from the work that they did. So for policymakers, this is probably not going to be a huge surprise, but their hope was, from a follow-up, that the data would be used to provide guidance, create consistency and accountability on how funeral care organisations could be sustainable, and that policymakers may look to incentivise the industry and support us all to reduce carbon emissions associated with our work and the funerals that we support people with. From the industry, the call was to gather as much data as possible and share it as an open source. So carry on the very fledgling bit of work that Planet Mark did to say this can be made publicly available. It might not be perfect, but together actually we can incrementally make a really big difference. A reminder to look at the process as a whole, not get too fixated on coffins alone. Yes, there are coffins, but there are also lots more considerations. How is land used? How is it maintained? What's the impact on air, soil, land? There is, in Planet Mark's opinion, a great opportunity for trade associations to show leadership in this space within the funeral industry. I'm guessing most of you will be familiar, but funeral care is currently not regulated. So we don't have a regulator who may step in with some clear direction. So in the absence of that, whether trade associations might be in a position to think that, and maybe some of that I guess implies funeral directing trade associations, but there are other groups, some of which I know there are representatives here today, who also support people with funerals, who maybe could pick up that baton and lead the way with this. And they also, Planet Mark suggested that, as with any other industries, is not exclusive to funeral care, that there are probably some products and processes which we really ought to be phasing out, and recognise that in our vision of what a sustainable funeral care looks like in the future, that these products and processes just don't have a place within that, and we need to work to find alternatives which support people with the funerals that they need and want, but there are more sustainable. And then for funeral directors, so I guess the call to us was to use this to improve public knowledge and awareness so that people can make evidence-based choices. to try and encourage industry change as a player within the industry, and again to try and remove certain options from a supply chain. Now we've been working quite hard at that, and it's really hard because there are not comparable alternatives to some of the big hitters from a carbon perspective, so it's tricky.